Hey everyone, I just want to take a few minutes to add some context to a video that's circulating online. It shows a Chicago police officer shoot and kill a 13-year-old boy named Adam Toledo. Just to give you some idea of who I am, so my name's Tom Baker. I was a police officer for about 9 years, worked in a major American city in a variety of positions, patrol, investigative roles, as a recruit training officer, training new police recruits at the academy. And now I study police use of force as a PhD student. So I spend a ton of time reading accounts of officer-involved deaths, police-involved deaths, and also have watched just a ton of these videos. So what I wanted to do is just to take a few minutes and walk through the video and sort of show how someone like me who spends a lot of time examining this issue, what we're looking for and what we're seeing as we watch the video. So we're going to be seeing video from 3 different sources. The first source is going to be mounted to this the east side of this building, which is a church. And that's a surveillance camera we're going to see out in front of the church. Second source is going to be body camera footage from the police officer's perspective, and it's going to show them running southbound through this alleyway, and this stars where the actual shooting takes place. And then there's going to be a third source of video coming from this building, a security camera footage shooting over this parking lot, and it's going to give us a view of the shooting location as well as the corner in front of that church where the initial shots fired takes place. And the audio will kick in here in a minute when we switch to the next angle. Apparently this is a 21-year-old male. He's walking with Adam Toledo. It's in the middle of the night, early morning hours. Here's from that building looking over the parking lot. And if you zoom in, you're going to see 2 figures emerge. Matches up with the other surveillance footage we just saw with Adam and the 21-year-old male. The audio is going to kick in and we're going to hear some gunshots. So we hear it sounded like 9 gunshots. We're going to see them run away in a second. And what this did is it triggered a system that the city has in place where there are these audio sensors trying to detect gunshots. And then based on the location of those sensors, it triangulates and it gives an estimate of where the shots were fired, and then sends that information to the police who respond. And this is an effort to reduce shootings. And it also generated a couple of 911 calls of shots fired as well. So that's what evoked the police response. We see these guys running northbound in front of the church. And my guess, I don't know, would be that they circled back into that alley and start traveling southbound. That's when we switch over to the officer's body camera footage. We're going to see him get out of his patrol car. Apparently it's a 2-person patrol car, so he's got a partner with him, and then start to go southbound through the alley and chase 2 individuals. The first person he encounters in this brown jacket sort of like pushes him to the ground, presumably so that his partner can make an arrest and detain him, and then continue chasing Adam southbound through the parking lot. We're going to hear audio in a second.
Stop right now. Hey, show me your fucking head.
So we hear, it sounds like, you can't be certain, but it sounds like he identifies himself as a police officer and gives him commands to show him his hands. The PD froze right here for us, and we can see, looks like Adam holding an object in his hand. They have it labeled as a firearm.
Stop it.
We have Adam turn around very quickly. The blur here makes it kind of difficult, but as you watch the video through, you can see it doesn't appear as though he's holding a firearm in his hands when he's shot. So we see really quickly again.
Please stop. Stop right now. Hey, show me your fucking head.
Show me your hands. We see a gun.
Stop it. Stop it.
Drop it. Turns around real quick. Shots are fired. Here's that surveillance. So this is from that building looking out over the parking lot again. And here's the alleyway. And we see the officer here running. And Adam has already gone behind this concealment here. And the officer's chasing him southbound through the parking lot. There goes Adam. Adam arrives here, sort of slows down. It seems like he's almost like fishing in his pockets. And my guess would be, and I don't know, again, we would need a full investigation, but my initial suspicions are that Adam is pulling out the firearm. The officer's going to see him pull out that firearm, and then Adam is going to throw the firearm, because later officers locate a firearm resting against the fence on the inside of the parking lot here. So this boy pulls out a gun, wants to follow the officer's commands, throws the gun, and turns around and puts his hands up in the air to surrender, and the officer shoots him. He turns around and he's shot. And then later, officers find a firearm. And now this would be on the inside of that parking lot. Up here would be where Adam was standing when he was shot, and the officer would be off screen when the shooting took place. And out on this street and to the left would be where those initial shots were fired that evoked a police response. So let's go back to the moment where force was used and talk a little bit about how I would evaluate something like this. So the first thing I'm looking for is, what was the totality of the information available to the officer at the moment that they used force? So in this particular case, there was some software that picked up gunshots at a particular location, and then a couple of 911 calls reporting it. Officer responds, sees two males. One of the males runs southbound through the alley. There's a short foot pursuit. The officer sees a gun in this person's hand, and then Adam turns around and the officer fires the shot. Sort of, that's the moment where the shot was fired. What was that information that was available to him leading up to that moment? The second thing we're looking at is the threat that was faced by the officer. So was it a threat to the officer's safety, to the safety of a third person, to the state's interest in a prosecution of some kind, an investigation of some kind? What was the severity of that threat? The immediacy? Was it something that was going to happen right there? Did the person who presented the threat, did they have the ability, the opportunity, the intention? Did they display an intention to use that force or present that threat that the officer was concerned about? In this particular case, again, I haven't spoken with the officer. From what I understand, the officer thought that when Adam turned around that he still had the gun and was going to shoot the officer. So that was sort of the threat that the officer is saying that what they were in fear of. The third thing is sort of the foreseeable outcome. So if the officer were to engage in a use of force response, what's the likely foreseeable outcome? And in this particular case, the officer decided to discharge their firearm to stop this perceived threat by shooting center mass at a human being from a short distance. And I think it's pretty obvious that the foreseeable outcome would be that this person would be struck with a bullet and they could be seriously physically injured or die. There's also a risk to the community and whenever you discharge a firearm in a city. So those are the sort of the foreseeable outcomes that the officer needs to deal with. And then the last thing that I'm looking at is balancing those two things, is saying, so what was the threat that a reasonable officer at the scene would have thought they were facing, and then what would a reasonable officer have thought the foreseeable outcomes of using that force were? And then I balance those things and I say, well, would a reasonable officer have used that force given the totality of the information that's available at that moment, given the threat the officer, a reasonable officer would have thought they were facing in that moment, and what a reasonable officer would have thought the outcome was? Balancing those things, was it a reasonable decision from the perspective of a reasonable officer? I've said reasonable a million times because that's the key word. I even underlined it to stress it. And in this particular case, when I look at this, and again, I don't have all of the information, if this officer thought that Adam was turning with a gun and they feared for their life, and I understand why that could be. We understand that human beings in stressful situations and low light environments with less than a second to respond can misinterpret someone turning around and dropping a gun to somebody turning around and threatening them with the gun. I can understand how a reasonable officer could interpret it that way. I'm not saying that that the officer did the right thing. Obviously not. It looks like they made a terrible mistake in shooting, but I can also understand how, given the totality of the circumstances and the situation that they faced, how somebody could make that mistake. So I think we can all agree that this is terrible. We have a 13-year-old boy who's trying to surrender to the police, puts his hands in the air, turns around, and he's shot and killed. Is awful. How do we reduce these types of deaths from taking place? How do we stop something like this from happening in the future? So there are basically three mechanisms in place to control police violence in the United States. The first one is laws. So there's legislation in place that makes it illegal for police officers to engage in certain behaviors. If an officer does that, you prosecute them, and it sends a signal to the rest of the law enforcement community. So in this case, you would prosecute this officer and say they did something illegal. I don't think that that's probably going to be the best solution here. From what I can see, and just an initial evaluation of the video and the news reports, is that this is an officer making a split-second decision. They saw a weapon, Adam turned around, they misinterpreted, they felt as though their life was in danger, and they responded with deadly force. I think that's something that a reasonable officer, that I could see them doing in that situation. So I don't think prosecuting them is going to be the best solution. I think this is just a terrible mistake that was made by the officer, and I think that's what this was. I don't think that there was any malice. The second option, the second way to control police violence, is through policy. So each agency has a list of policies that they've written. They train the officers on those policies and use policy to help control police behavior and shape police behavior. I see a couple of opportunities here, and I'm not advocating for either of them. These would be decisions that each agency would need to make. But foot pursuits, there are some law enforcement agencies in the United States that severely restrict foot pursuits because they've said, look, they're really dangerous. They end in fights. They end in lethal force encounters. We're going to avoid them at all costs. Or if we do engage in a foot pursuit, it's going to only be for X, Y, or Z. And when we do, we're not going to allow partners to split up. We're going to have them stay together. There's a whole bunch of rules and regulations that could go into a foot pursuit that may have made it so that this officer would have said, okay, well, this one guy is stopping. We're going to detain him, question him, and we'll catch up with the guy who ran away later. I'm not saying that that's necessarily what you'd want to do, because there's a balancing act. Does the community want their police department to allow somebody who's suspected of firing off rounds in the community to just get away on foot? But that is an option, severely limiting foot pursuits. Another thing that I noticed was the strobe light. So a lot of handguns that officers carry will have weapon-mounted lights, and a feature on that light can be a strobe function where the light goes on and off really quickly. And I looked around to see if I could find some literature on whether or not using a strobe light impairs or inhibits the officer's ability to interpret what they're seeing. And I couldn't find anything, couldn't find a lot, but I did find a lot of literature talking about how strobe lights impact human beings and animals and inhibit their ability to interpret information. And I know, having a strobe light pointed at you, there's a reason you do it when you're trying to alter people's perceptions of reality. That's why the officer's pointing a strobe light at them. But I wonder if that strobe light has an impact on the officer's ability to see what Adam is doing. So I think it would be important for research to be conducted to determine whether or not using a strobe light inhibits the officer's ability to interpret suspect's behavior and to interpret their movement. And that could be something in this case. And again, I don't have hard evidence of that, but it's something I'm suspicious of. So that's another thing that could be looked at. So those are the two things that stood out in terms of possible policy reforms. So severely restricting foot pursuits, and then examining whether or not that strobe light may have played a role in the officer's ability to properly interpret Adam's behavior. And if there were evidence that was the case, then you could restrict the use of the strobe lights. Then there's the third layer is professional ethics. And that's just when laws and policies permit an officer to use force, but the officer and police culture has said, it's, even though legally we're justified in using force and by policy we're justified in using force, that morally and ethically this is just inappropriate. And I don't think that this is one of those cases. I just mentioned it because there are instances where that can play a role, and it's sort of like the final safeguard in controlling police use of force. So those are my thoughts. Those are the things that I observed. I hope that you find them valuable. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you to Coffee or Die.